The legacy of Che Guevara. I wanted to talk about this because it turns out that yesterday, glorious day, was the 57th anniversary of his death.
Hooray!
The 9th of October, 1967.
I celebrated with a glass of wine.
As you should, I'm sure many did, across the country and across the world. And I thought we'd look at the legacy of Che Guevara, and I wanted to ask the question, why is it exactly the left still really like him? I know that he's been turned, ironically enough, into a bit of a capitalist system symbol because he is the face of a lot of products out there. Caps, T-shirts, logos. I believe his image has been used for advertising things.
It's ironic, isn't it?
Things like washing detergent. So, you know. Yes. When I was looking into
Venezuela or something.
Possibly, maybe even in California.
You use that detergent and it makes your clothes more dirty than when you start.
It makes them smell terrible. Yeah, I bet. Smell like a Bolivian jungle. But because when you look into the guy, it's remarkable. One, how much his social views, outside of his virtue signalling to the UN, were out of step with today's left. And two, how remarkably bad at whatever he tried to do he was. Because I was looking into it, and they all celebrate him as this amazing guerrilla revolutionary. He helped Castro brothers to overthrow the Batista regime with his amazing guerrilla warfare. He wrote the book on guerrilla warfare.
I've read that.
Yeah, but it's rubbish. And his advice seems terrible, and every other campaign that he engaged in went terribly and eventually got him killed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, taking advice on guerrilla warfare from someone who died doing guerrilla warfare is probably not the best thing you could do.
Well, also, from everything that I know about the conflict, it was mainly because Batista's army was rubbish and very easily bribable that they won in the first place.
In such cases.
He did fight many guerrilla campaigns, and the only one that met with any real success was in Cuba. The final one in Bolivia was an abject failure. I don't think they turned one Bolivian Indian native over to their cause, not one. So,
well, no, there are remarks he made in his diaries saying about how annoyed he was that none of the peasants are siding with him.
One of the things I would say, I'm fascinated by Che Guevara in the same way I'm fascinated by Stalin or Pol Pot or something. Not that I agree with the man on anything, but still fascinated by his life and fascinated by the story of it all. Have been for a long time. I did all of Central and Mesoamerica in the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. I'm going to do some epochs about
and this
Mexico
is on your epoch series,
available
for premium subscribers to the website.
I did a Brokenomics with Dan not too long ago, or 6 months, a year ago or so, talking about a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman, where it talks all about the 50s, 60s, more 60s and 70s, about America's involvement and the CIA, the intelligence services involvement in Central and Southern America. So know all about that. It's a great book, a very, very interesting book. Just to say, before I go on, there's no real goodies in this story. It's not like America are the goodies, like 1950s CIA under Alan Dulles are the goodies. No.
They were supporting military dictatorships who murdered a lot of people.
I think Che Guevara is a monstrous figure. But I think Alan Dulles is similar, for example. Batista is a monstrous figure, in my opinion. There's no real goodies in this, right? That's my opinion. So, anyway, I am a rightist, so I'm not going to be any sort of apologist for Che Guevara. But I would say I did another bit of content with Connor, one of my earlier epochs, all about Lucky Luciano. There's the big connection between the mob and the second Batista premiership. So I know about this topic, in and around this topic, a fair bit, hopefully.
Well, you probably know more than I do. I've done some very, very cursory research into it. But again, from the research that I have done, Guevara just seems a bit rubbish.
Well, I honestly do think he was something like a psychopath.
Oh, judging by some of the stuff that I've found, yes.
Apart from the details, and we can get into and argue about the exact details of what he ordered, you get some modern-day commie apologists saying, he didn't do he only ever executed guilty people of things. Anyway, we can get into it. But one example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, or just after, he said openly, if our government, because he was in the Cuban government, if our government controlled those ballistic missiles, I would fire them. If it was up to me, I would fire them on America. So that's insane. That's insane. The Soviets were embarrassed by his police state. The Soviets in the 60s. I do see him as a barrier type figure, a monstrous person. But there you go. People out there might disagree with me, and you will get modern day apologists, bread tubers, or whatever, who say didn't do nothing. But
no, he's a terrible person.
We know how to qualify their judgments, though, don't we? Yeah, and I think your judgment is brought out by the facts as well that I've got in front of me right now. So we'll get into that in a moment. First, though, don't buy Che Guevara's book. What you can do is spend your hard-earned money on Islander instead, which you still only have a very, very limited time to buy. By the time this goes out on YouTube, you will likely only have about 24 hours or so to buy it, because this is the last week it'll be on sale. £14.99. Well spent if you pick up a copy. So do that right now, or you're going to La Cabana. So yeah, Jacobin put this out, which is what got me thinking about this in the first place. It was a very smiling picture of Che Guevara. Look at how well made up he was. Look at how iconic he was. I mean, yeah, he looks like
a Reddit mod.
He looks like a scruffy cleaner for whatever TV studio that he's in. These look like cleaners' overalls, and he is vaguely Mexican looking. So
vaguely Mexican looking.
I know he was Argentine.
He's an Argy, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was an Argy, but still
Spanish.
He looks like he would be, asleep, leaning against his broom. Oh, I'm so sleepy.
I'm so tired.
I'm so tired. I can't believe I'm on my break. But they pointed out, they were celebrating his life. Revolutionary Che Guevara was executed on this day in 1967. The life of a single human being is worth more than all of the property of the richest man on earth.
I'm sure he lived by this.
Oh, yes. This was one of his leading first principles of the value of a single human life. He would never take a single human life. It always had to be multiples at a time.
Right. I was going to say, unless you're a counter-revolutionary in a revolution he was involved in which case he would order your execution without a blink of an eye.
Oh, he was ruthless. I mean, even then, counter-revolutionary, that suggests that he'd done some form of process of determining guilt and judicial trial or anything. No, if he just had a gut feeling, this is a wrong 'un.
He'd only very occasionally shoot people himself. Though.
Oh, like all brave men. He
merely ordered thousands to be shot. The families of people they thought were counter-revolutionary. I mean, it's a Robespierre-style reign of terror he oversaw there. Yeah. Well, it's hard baked into all communist revolutions that any counter-revolution must be stamped into oblivion.
Well, it's also an ideology overwhelmingly driven by envy and resentment.
Yeah.
And so, of course, when you get people who are from the worst bottom rungs of society where they don't really have morals and it's all just a crab bucket problem where they'll all just pull each other down. Of course, if you're out of the bucket, they'll just try and pull you in, and if you refuse, they'll kill you.
Or bougie middle-class people that have never really got over the guilt of that. He was born into a family much richer than mine. He was brought up in much more affluence than I was, for example.
He was a doctor, wasn't he?
He lived in a big house. I think they had servants. I'm pretty sure they had a servant or two. He went to a medical uni. His father did quite well for them. He was bourgeois.
A psychopath bourgeois.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this got this kind of response that you would expect. Memes of Che Guevara sending people to camps. Oh, you're so sweet. But when Adolf Hitler does it, all of a sudden there's a problem. And it makes you think, well, people still go out of their way to try and defend him. People still go out of the way to try to praise his legacy. And so I thought, okay, what is it people are still saying about him? So I go to the one place, here's one of the more iconic photos of him. Basically dead.
He's brown bread in that one, right?
That might be one where he's dead. Yeah. I think that's after he'd been killed. So YouTube, please don't demonetize us for that one. This is a Guardian article.
Might have to pixelate that out.
Yeah, might have to pixelate that. So this is from 2017, and they're talking about his legacy and what it was all for. What was all the death for, Che? What did you kill all of those people for? What were the children? What did they die for?
Freedom, of course.
Yeah. So they say, he did things. He toppled Cuba's US-backed dictator, Batista, or helped. He lectured the United States from a UN lectern, so he, virtue signaled on the grandest scale imaginable.
Can do that without killing people.
Just quickly to say, Batista, again, in his second premiership, was extremely corrupt and murderous himself. He was running a type of police state. 10, 20,000 people were executed or murdered for political reasons under Batista. And he's extremely, extremely corrupt and letting the mafia, it was like almost government by gangsters, and letting the mobsters, people like Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano, run a lot of things. gambling and all sorts of stuff. So it's not like Batista was a good guy. Let's just be clear about that.
But again, just because the guy they're toppling is a good guy doesn't automatically make you
two wrongs don't make a right, do they?
Either. No, of course.
Don't.
And the US should be criticised for supporting a regime like that, of course. But also he penned treaties on Marxism and guerrilla warfare and sought to export socialism worldwide. So these are the things they're praising him for. I don't see anything praiseworthy in that. Obviously, you could say, oh, well, he toppled a dictator, helped topple a dictator. But again, the regime that it was replaced with was no better. Many would say much worse.
Give you the measure of the man. In the 50s, as a younger chap, he put his hand on a picture of Stalin and swore that he would be a revolutionary, a lifelong revolutionary from that point onwards. Now, anyone in the 1950s that does such a thing is crazy, in my opinion. Ever since the show trials and the purges of the 1930s, anyone that tried to keep up the pretense that Stalin was anything other than a terrible, terrible tyrant is just not being honest with themselves or reality or history and things. So if you do something like that in the 50s...
Well, yeah, because during the Second World War and the 1940s, obviously there was the whole Uncle Stalin picture that the US and Britain was trying to promote of Stalin of, oh yeah, well, the Soviets were bad, but now they're helping us fight the Nazis. They're great. Uncle Stalin, he's a good guy. They're fighting for freedom. I've seen pictures, literally, of a Soviet soldier, and this was American propaganda, where it said in big, bold letters, "This man is your friend. He fights for freedom." That's not what they were fighting for. That's not. They were just basically fighting to repel, to throw out Germans who had tried to invade them.
Remember, that was only a moment of time during the war, both before and after that period. The Soviets were the enemy.
After, as soon as the Cold War becomes entrenched, then all of a sudden they go, okay, Stalin maybe he was a good guy a little bit during that period because he helped us fight Hitler, but now he's a bad guy again.
Remember, the show trials of the 30s were done openly, effectively. So there's just no denying.
Yeah, and then
what Stalin was.
Then by his death in '53, you get Khrushchev with his de-Stalinization and the anti-Stalin speech that was supposedly secret but got leaked immediately. So everybody knew what a bad person he was, and overgrown, emotionally bankrupt children like Che Guevara see a mass murdering tyrant who managed to wield power with an iron fist, who crushed all of his enemies, and go, well, I want to be that.
Yeah,
that's what I want to do. Same with Mao.
Yeah, I mean, Che Guevara was a cold warrior, right? That's what he was, right? As a man of his time, as everyone is doomed to be, he was a cold warrior, and he did see lots and lots of poverty, but he just incorrectly puts that down to capitalism. And that's the fault of capitalism entirely. It's not how it works. In fact, the profit motive, these places would have been much worse off if it wasn't for the profit.
Well, yeah, the free exchange of goods and services was not the problem.
Right, exactly. So, just look at the example of Cuba itself, how it stayed backwards, essentially, economically speaking, in all sorts of ways, because they don't have a free economy. There's no better thing to raise people out of poverty than free market. But they just won't accept. They just don't accept that, do they?
Well, I mean, some of the people in the kinds of countries that he was attempting to liberate now maybe have changed their tune a little bit, because amusingly in this article they include some figures. Now these would have been from 2017, so we're talking 7 years old, but at the time Pew Research had done some work looking into the opinions of Latin Americans aged 18 to 29. They were about 72% of them viewed the US favorably by 2017, which is basically the opposite of what Che Guevara wanted, probably because the sorts of policies that he had promoted for so long and tried to implement everywhere are so obviously disastrous and leave you in poverty and unable to feed or clothe yourself, and you die too young.
No, absolutely. I mean, if you look at earlier in his life, before the Cuba period, he goes to Guatemala. And again, in the Brokenomics I did with Dan, all about Confessions of an Economic Hitman, we talked all about Arbenz Guzman, who was the leader of sort of a populist leader of Guatemala, and he threw out the United Fruit Company, which was a CIA front company, and there was all sorts of exploitation going on, right? So it's not that that's not the case. It's not that quote unquote capitalism was completely pure in Central and Southern America in the post-war period. It wasn't. The United Fruits Company, it was a pretty terrible thing. But it doesn't mean let's bring in Maoist-style sort of having no private property and all that sort of thing. Because one thing he did in Cuba, once after they became the government, one thing is he asked everyone to hand in their agricultural implements, agricultural tools, and they would smelt them down into the original materials and make other things. Classic Maoist policy, that is. That's straight out of the Great Leap Forward. And completely mad. Completely mad. It doesn't work. It just simply doesn't work.
Well, the decision that you're describing there is the decision to take all of the tools that you know works and then reforge them into something that we hope works, ? Or maybe just reappropriate them for some other use opposed to agriculture.
Well, the materials you get out of them, the iron or steel you might smelt down, is going to be of a really poor quality. And now the people just don't have the tools to work the land anymore. So famine may well ensue. It's completely bonkers. Lots of people say about Che Guevara that he was some sort of political genius. Not at all. Not at all. He was some sort of philosopher. When he was in the equivalent of high school, he was hanging with undergrad students and he was more clever than them. Yeah, well it couldn't have been a very high bar then, because this guy was a bit...
Generally, people like that I've found tend to just be pretentious arses.
Yeah, right.
They think they can hang out with people who are older and cooler than them, but really they're just talking out of their arse and have no idea what they're talking about.
And what you said right near the beginning, other than the Cuban campaigns, everything he turned his hand to, it sort of was either a very, very big or if not an abject failure. So I don't think he was very good in any respect.
So that might be why leftists like him so much still.
Yeah.
You know, oh my God, he failed at everything he ever did, just like me. Maybe I can have my face on a t-shirt one day.
Yeah.
Like the one thing he was successful at was standing next to Castro in a picture.
Right.
That's the thing he's most remembered for, really. He also, you know, he gave a speech at the UN by December 1964. Wikipedia describes him as a revolutionary statesman of world stature, as you know, all of the communists were in the 1960s, because for some reason the international community seemed to hold quite a few of them aloft. Interesting, in an anti-communist period. On 11th December, during his hour-long impassioned address at the UN, he criticised the United Nations' inability to confront the brutal policy of apartheid. Again, I've got to ask, why are you letting this man, if the UN is supposed to be a large international bulwark for peace in the world, why even let him give a speech? By this point, everybody knows that he's essentially a mass murderer. Not a good person, but the UN does anyway, probably because, you know, he gives voice to all of these things that the international community already supported, which was anti-colonialism. The British Empire is dying, the US needs more rhetoric to support the destruction of the British Empire. Well, okay, let's put this guy up and he's going to give a massive virtue signal social justice speech, which he did. And then he criticised the US as well, saying, those who kill their own children and discriminate daily against them because of the colour of their skin, those who let the murderers of blacks remain free, protecting them and furthermore punishing the black population, because this is after the Civil Rights Act as well. So this is all rubbish. This is all outdated rubbish by this time. And there were already massive riots going on in the US. Each year you had, like the Summer of Love in 2010 times 10 each year for most of the 1960s in a lot of US cities.
Guevara was simply an agent of chaos, in my opinion. You go from Argentina to Bolivia to Peru to Guatemala to Cuba to the Congo, trying to just ferment chaos, and then talk about apartheid, and then talk about civil rights in America, just in any possible way how we can sow division and chaos and misery.
Well, and his writings since have been used a lot for that as well, because he did write a lot. He wrote a lot of his diaries, and he wrote a few books as well, mostly Marxist nonsense about the need to divest humanity of the necessity of working for profit motives. Work, I suppose, in this will just be done because it's done. People will just work because they'll work. They won't need any reason to work. They'll just do it, which is Marxist fantasy nonsense.
You read the gorilla one, didn't you?
Yeah, of course. It was obvious, just like if you capture people's communications, you can stop them from communicating, or making sure you have enough food is very important. It was so common sense as to be a waste of time. There wasn't anything that I read and thought, wow, that's interesting. And it's also very out of date as well, because a lot of the technology he's talking like the importance of having certain kinds of medicine and things like that. And it's just like, oh, if you're fighting in a jungle, you need medicine. Well done.
Slow hand clap for Che.
Yeah, I did see some excerpts that some were posting from it as well, where he was advising, don't wait for the conditions to be right to attack. If the weather's not on your side, just do it anyway because you feel like it.
I think the idea was that he made it as simple and basic as possible to try and get as many people to read it. But in so doing, it made it far less valuable. Perhaps he could have written something a bit better, but at the same time, knowing that he wasn't really that adept at what he did, I don't think he would have been the best person for this sort of thing.
I read some of the Motorcycle Diaries. It was dull. Earlier on in his life, he went on a long, a couple of
film about that.
Couple of
as well,
long,
didn't
yeah. Couple of long trips on motorbike.
I've seen that actually, that film.
I've not.
The book,
isn't it?
dull as dishwater.
Isn't it?
I'm imagining the film.
Benicio del Toro, isn't it? Playing him.
It was a long time ago. It's like 2007.
I suppose the film is. I would assume is idealising it.
Yeah, basically.
Quite a lot.
Yeah. He's a good guy who just sees injustice in the world, wants to fight against that.
Yeah, he just hated South African apartheid and what was happening to his fellow people, his fellow workers of the world. They needed to unite to break their chains. Thank you, Hollywood. Very cool. The left have gone back and assessed him, though, like this Jacobin article from 2016, which I found very interesting. There's not really much point reading it because literally his only point is he wasn't socialist enough. They see the guiding principle of organisation, meaning that you have to have leaders at the top actually organising the people below, which even for somebody as rubbish as Guevara was obvious because, well, yeah, you need leaders. It's too good. That's not good enough. Not good enough for Jacobin. They say, well, you weren't democratic enough. People just, in the same way that Marxists thinking is, well, people will just work because they'll just work. That's as far as the principle goes. Organised movements will just kind of happen without leadership. So that's as far as their criticism goes. That he was a leader, therefore bad, because leader is hierarchical, therefore hierarchy bad, nonsense. I would have thought the fact that he, ordered the execution of 12-year-olds would be the thing that you would want to criticise him for. Or even from a modern leftist perspective, like is written about in here, the fact that he was not exactly socially progressive in some ways. He worked with a lot. He worked in the Congo, and he worked with black revolutionaries.
They hated gays, didn't they? They tried to eradicate all gays from Cuba at one point. Was that a thing?
They were rounded up and put into concentration camps, which Guevara helped set up. Yes, but. They're not going to mention anything like that. Okay. That's inconvenient. Sure. But they don't mention also. He wrote about when he was in. The blacks living in Caracas, Venezuela, he said that they were magnificent examples of the African race because they didn't bathe at all. And he praised their racial superiority because of that. Very interesting.
That's the most commie thing I've ever heard. He praised them for not washing.
Yes. I mean, can you imagine this guy who spent most of his adult life smelly in the bushes of a jungle somewhere, praising people for not washing. But the most interesting stuff comes from this article, which has a lot of good information. So I'll just read some of this, and it'll talk about some of the stuff that you've been talking about there as well, Bo, and explain kind of what he did after the Cuban Revolution, which really cements his legacy in leftist eyes. Not because he was any kind of social progressive or actually good at what he did, mainly that he was a childish psychopath who did everything he could to butcher his enemies at every opportunity, which of course we know is the real guiding principle of the left.
Member of the Jacobin Club. That's why I say I think of him like a Robespierre. At some point, you have to murder everyone that's standing against you.
And he did.
Go ahead.
So in April 1967, speaking from experience, he summed up his idea of justice in his message to the Tricontinental, saying, hatred as an element of struggle, unbending hatred for the enemy, which pushes a human being beyond his natural limitations, making him into an effective, violent, selective, and cold-blooded killing machine. That's pretty out there, pretty psychopathic. And they give some examples of him being a cold-blooded killing machine. So after the collapse of the Batista regime, Castro put him in charge of La Cabana prison. Guevara presided during the first half of 1959, and there's some examples given here. So Javier Azuega, the Basque chaplain who gave comfort to those in the prison who were sentenced to die and personally witnessed dozens of executions, spoke to the author of this article recently, and he He said that there were about 800 prisoners in a space fit for no more than 300 former Batista military and police personnel, some journalists, a few businessmen and merchants. The Revolutionary Tribunal was made of militiamen. Che Guevara presided over the appellate court. He never overturned a sentence. I would visit those on death row. A rumour went around that I hypnotised prisoners because so many remained calm, so Che ordered that I be sent to be present at all the executions. After I left in May, they executed many more, but I personally witnessed 55. There was an American, Herman Monks, apparently a former convict, who was called the Butcher because he enjoyed giving the order to shoot. I pleaded many times with Che on behalf of prisoners. I remember especially the case of Ariel Lima, a young boy. Che did not budge, nor did Fidel, who I visited. I became so traumatized that at the end of May, I was ordered to leave the parish where La Cabana was located and where I had held mass for 3 years. I went to Mexico for treatment. The day I left, Che told me that we had both tried to bring one another to each other's sides and had failed. His last words to me were, "When we take our masks off, we will be enemies." Pretty forceful. And the first forced labour camp, Guanahacabibs, don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, was set up in western Cuba at the end of 1960. This is how Che explained its function. We only send to this camp those doubtful cases where we are not sure people should go to jail, people who have committed crimes against revolutionary morals, so political thought crimes, to a greater or lesser degree. It's not hard labour, it is hard labour, not brute labour. Rather, the working conditions there are hard. This camp was the precursor to the eventual systematic confinement, starting in 1965, of dissidents, homosexuals, aid victims, Catholics, Jehovah's Witnesses, Afro-Cuban priests, and other such peoples under the banner of the military units to help production. So just any political dissident, anybody they didn't like, get sent to the gulags, basically. And the great revolutionary, it says as well, when you're talking about his economics, Marxist economics always end well, as we know. How did they end in Cuba? His idea of social justice, he was the head of the National Bank of Cuba and the Department of Industry at the end of 1959, and starting in early 1961 as Minister of Industry. Most of the Cuban economy saw near collapse of sugar production, the failure of industrialization, and the introduction of rationing. And this is at the point, where just whatever you want to criticize Batista for, it was one of Latin America's foremost economically successful countries since before the dictatorship of Batista. And that's what, his economic policies reduced the country to. So well done. Well done. So leftists love Che because he was a useless, petty, childish, cold-blooded killing machine murderer who never achieved anything good in his life. That's his legacy. There we go.
I hope you appreciated that segment from the podcast The Lotus Eaters, and if you want to see what else we're doing, you can watch our series Lads Hour on the website, where we have lots of fun and talk about silly things. And if you want to see all the other things we're doing, you can always follow us on Twitter. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.